Lazy initialization is the fastest way and most user-responsive approach to initializing web components in web applications. It uses two fundamental techniques or principles: event delegation and factories for decorators. Decorator factories, as I like to call them. Event delegation works by adding an event listener to an ancestor node, typically for bubbling. That ancestor node will then have access to whatever the target that was clicked on, and then it can make a decision on what it wants to do with that particular target. The factory is what the event handler passes that particular target, so that the factory can then either get the component that has already been created and pooled in an object pool, or create the object, put that object into a pool, and then return it. The factory uses a decorator pattern to decorate that particular element. And by decorate, I don't mean by adding visual things to it. I mean using the design pattern decorator. So the decorator has access to that element, either by a direct property or by access to the elements, like the ID of the element, or some way to get access in the DOM to that element. This is more efficient because if no initialization, if the user never interacts with that particular thing, then there's not going to be any initialization. There's not going to be any creation of a decorator for that object. If the user does interact with it, it will first look to see if that decorator has already been created. And if it has, well, obviously there's no need to recreate something that already is there. So then it gets returned. And if it hasn't been created, in the worst case scenario, the slowest performance is when the user first interacts with that particular component. And then that has to create the component by making the decorator and then doing what it needs to do. And in the worst case of those are when there might be extra data requests for that particular component that could not possibly have existed on that page. And that's the worst possible case. So the user clicks something, oh, it's got to make a request for some data, and then things are loading. And the design of that particular widget is going to be determined by and influenced by how that widget's supposed to behave, what the data exchange is going to be with the server, if there is going to be any extra data exchange with the server. This has several advantages over upfront initialization. The first and most obvious is that if the user doesn't interact with a particular thing on the page, then there's no need to initialize it. So there's less memory and there's less processing involved. And the second most obvious thing is that if there are a large number of things on the page that need possibly to handle such user interaction, calculators and sliders and color pickers and all kinds of different things that could be on the page. All kinds of calendars, who knows what could be on that particular page. Then all those things need not be initialized, right? The user goes to the page and says, oh, that's the wrong page. I'm going to go somewhere else. No need to initialize anything on that page. The user left. However, in a big upfront initialization, everything needs to be initialized because we have no idea what the user is going to be clicked on. Very inefficient, slow. There's no reason for that. Now, slow in relative terms today is not that slow because browsers are miles, orders of magnitude faster. They're just so much faster than they were 20 years ago. Right? Or we had limitations on how much JavaScript we can even include on a page. However, there are measurable differences in initialization strategies. The other reason that it tends to be faster is that most of the modern JavaScript libraries, and this isn't necessarily true, but in practice, de facto, it generally is. In practice, the way these libraries work is they intermingle the HTML and the JavaScript, thereby creating a requirement within the JavaScript to create more HTML widgets to then apply those widgets to the page. Now, not only is this less search engine friendly because the search engine's not going to be parsing all of that JavaScript, although some may, and I believe Googlebot does do some evaluation of some JavaScript, although to what extent, I don't know. That's all proprietary. However, that's not the only benefit. Search engines are not the only benefit. SEO is not the only benefit. The other benefit is that you don't have to use the DOM to create your HTML. The HTML is generally mostly in the page, as much as possible. Granted, there will be some situations where extra HTML widgets need to be created on the fly, and maybe some of that data is going to come from a server, an external HTTP request, when necessary. And when not necessary, that HTML can exist on the page, rather than having it created dynamically. And in those cases, it's obviously much more efficient because nothing needs to be created. It's already there, and it's parsed by the HTML parser of the web browser, which is designed and optimized and scrutinized over the last more than 2 decades to be as fast as possible and as accurate as possible, so you don't have to have all that extra code in your JavaScript to create the HTML. The fastest way to initialize widgets on web apps is by using lazy initialization and decorator factories, using an event listener on an ancestor node to then find an interesting element. If the element that the user interacted with is of interest to that particular event handler, then that event handler can then delegate to a decorator factory, get the decorator for that particular element, and if that decorator factory finds that that decorator doesn't exist in the object pool, then it can then request to create a new one and then return that to the event handler, which can then do something with that particular widget, such as maybe just initializing it, and then the widget takes care of all of its business on its own. I've been doing this for over 20 years. This is the most efficient way to do things.